A shot of whiskey in a Dodge City saloon went for 2 bits, 25 cents. A glass of beer poured from a wooden keg behind the bar cost a nickel, and a decent cigar off the back shelf cost another nickel. And on that same dusty street in Dodge City, Kansas, the famous Long Branch Saloon was one of more than 20 saloons selling the same whiskey at the same price to the same cowboys walking in from the same cattle trail. So here is the question almost nobody asks about the Wild West Saloon. If the drinks were cheap, and everyone sold them, and a working cowhand earned about $30 a month, how did any man standing behind that bar actually get rich? Most of them didn't. To understand why, you have to start with the thing that made the saloon business so appealing in the first place, which is the same thing that eventually destroyed almost everyone who tried it. Anyone could open one. On the American frontier in the 1870s, the startup cost of a saloon could be almost nothing. A canvas tent pitched on a muddy street in a mining camp. 2 whiskey barrels stood on end, a rough plank laid across the top of them to serve as a bar. A supply of cheap rot gut whiskey freighted in by wagon. That was the whole business. No lease, no liquor distributor relationship, no signage, and the regulatory environment was just as forgiving. There were no background checks, no bonding requirements. When local government finally organized itself and started issuing operating licenses, those licenses went to anyone who could pay the fee and the taxes. Nobody asked a man in a frontier town what he had done before he showed up. Which is exactly why the saloon business became the fallback career of the American West. An ex-lawman who lost an election could open a saloon. A gambler between towns could open a saloon. A man who failed at a placer claim in the Black Hills could tend bar for a few years until he had enough saved to buy land or run for office. Working behind a bar was not held against a man in a place where starting over was the entire point. And so in nearly every frontier settlement, the saloons came first. Before the church, before the school, before the courthouse. Photographs of main streets in Tombstone, Arizona, and Silverton, Colorado, and Deer Lodge, Montana, in the 1870s and 1880s show saloon after saloon lined up between the dry goods stores and the land offices. Which brings us to the first serious problem in the ledger. If anyone can open a saloon, everyone does. The Long Branch in Dodge City was not a landmark because it was the only place in town. It was one of more than 20 saloons operating in that single cattle town. Down in Leavenworth, Kansas, there were more than 150 saloons operating in the 1880s. Tombstone, at its silver peak, had well over 100 places a man could get a drink. Even the names repeated. The White Elephant and the Oriental appeared in town after town across the West, so common they could have been franchises. The White Elephant in Fort Worth inspired a Black Elephant. The Oriental inspired an Occidental. Now think about what that means for a man standing behind a plank bar in Leadville, Colorado in 1880. He is selling a commodity, whiskey freighted in by the same wagons that supply his competitors, beer from the same brewery, at prices the market has already fixed for him, because the man 40 feet down the boardwalk is charging the same nickel for the same warm beer. There is no product differentiation. There is no brand loyalty in a town where half the population arrived last month, and there is very little room to raise prices on a customer base of miners and cowhands with thin seasonal wallets. So let's look at what those wallets actually held, because this is where the popular image of the Wild West Saloon falls apart completely. A working cowhand in the late 1800s earned roughly $30 a month, and the phrase attached to that wage was 30 and found, meaning $30 plus his meals and a bunk at the ranch. A beginner might make 20 or 25. A top hand might reach 40. A trail boss made considerably more. Against that, a glass of beer was 5 cents. A shot of whiskey was 25 cents. A premium cigar was another nickel. Do that arithmetic. And a very old Hollywood myth dies immediately. The image of the cowboy riding into Dodge City and blowing an entire month's wages in one glorious night at the bar simply does not hold up. Drinking was cheap entertainment. A man would have had to consume a genuinely impossible quantity of whiskey to lose $30 across a bar in one evening. That is a wonderful thing if you are a thirsty cowhand in Kansas. It is a terrible thing if you are the man who has to pay rent, wages, freight costs, taxes, and a liquor license out of nickel beers. Which is why saloon keepers did what people selling commodities at fixed prices have always done. They cut the product. Bartenders across the West watered their beer and doctored their whiskey with additives to stretch the barrel further. It was not craftsmanship, it was margin recovery on a product that could not be priced any higher. And then there was the food. If you walked into a working-class saloon in Denver or Chicago or Fort Worth before the progressive reform era, you would find a spread laid out on one end of the bar, free with the purchase of a beer or two. Ham, smoked herring, rye bread, pickles, pretzels, salted crackers, sausage. That free lunch was not generosity. It was one of the most precisely engineered loss leaders in American commercial history. Every item on that counter was salted, and salted heavily, because salted food produces thirst, and thirst produces the next nickel beer, and the next one after that. A man could sit at that bar nibbling and drinking and nibbling for hours, and every cycle of that loop moved money across the counter. The system worked so well that breweries got involved directly, buying food cheaply in enormous quantities and supplying it to saloons at cost, because every plate of salted ham sold more of their beer. In one 4-mile stretch of a major Chicago street in the 1890s, there were 115 saloons serving free lunch, against only 5 restaurants charging 10 cents for a meal. Cheap restaurants genuinely could not compete with a bar giving food away. It worked so well that the free lunch created its own social parasite. The free lunch fiend was a recognized 19th century character, the man who drifted from saloon to saloon eating without buying, and part of the bouncer's actual job description was guarding the buffet from him. So the beer is a nickel, the whiskey is 25 cents. The food is free and salted. The margins are thin and the competition is fierce. Where, exactly, was the money? It was at the tables. Walk into the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona in 1881. The place the Tombstone epitaph called the most elegantly furnished saloon this side of the Golden Gate. And you would find it split into 2 distinct compartments. One side was the saloon, with the long bar and the polished fixtures. The other side was the gaming room. Those were not the same business. Milt Joyce built and owned the Oriental, but the gambling rooms inside his building were leased out to professional gamblers. Lou Rickabaugh, Dick Clark, and Bill Harris, a man who had held interests in the Long Branch back in Dodge City, arranged for that concession before the Oriental even opened its doors in July of 1880. They brought the layouts, the dealers, and the bankroll. Joyce provided the room, and that arrangement tells you everything about where the profit actually lived. The saloon owner built the marble and the mirrors and the gas lamps and the imported bar fixtures, and then he rented out the part of his own building that made the real money to somebody else. Faro was the dominant game across the West, followed by poker, brag, 3-card monte, and dice games like Chuck-a-Luck and Grand Hazard. And gambling was not a shady sideline. In 1881, it was regarded as a legitimate profession, roughly comparable in social standing to medicine or the clergy. The gaming concession at the Oriental was profitable enough that the operators wanted serious protection around it. In January of 1881, Wyatt Earp was reportedly given a 1/4 interest in that gambling concession in exchange for managing the room and keeping order in it. I want to be careful here, because this is one of the most repeated claims in Old West history, and the sourcing is genuinely mixed. Morgan Earp's interest in a Tombstone gambling concession is documented. Wyatt's is supported more by later recollection and circumstantial evidence than by clean contemporary records. Either way, Earp brought in Bat Masterson from Dodge City to help run the faro tables in February of 1881, and telegraphed the gambler Luke Short in Leadville that June with an offer to deal faro. That is what a saloon owner was really competing for. Not thirsty men, gamblers, because a man who is gambling stays in the building for hours, and a man who stays for hours drinks steadily the entire time. The tables did not just generate their own revenue, they were the reason the bar revenue existed at all. Which is why, when the gambling eventually went away, so did the entire business model. But we will get to that collapse in a few minutes. If this breakdown of frontier economics is your kind of history, hit subscribe. I take apart the real business ledgers behind the Old West every week. Now let's walk through the risks, because the gambling concession was only the profit side of the balance sheet. The cost side is where saloon keepers actually died. Risk number one was the government, and it arrived faster than most people assume. The frontier saloon has a reputation as a lawless enterprise, but taxation caught up almost immediately. An 1879 Texas law placed a tax of 18% on every hard liquor drink sold in the state. 18% off the top on a product already selling at a fixed 25 cents. A liquor license in Fort Worth ran $650 a year. Set that next to a cowhand's $30 a month, and you understand the scale. A saloon owner in Fort Worth had to earn more than 20 months of a working man's wages before he covered nothing but his permission to open the doors. And the timing here is almost cruel. The commercial cash register came into use in American saloons around exactly this period, and it made daily sales legible for the first time. Legible to the owner, certainly, but also legible to the taxman. The frontier saloon's era of comfortable vagueness about revenue was over. Municipal licenses were a major source of income for frontier towns, which meant the town had a direct financial incentive to keep licensing more saloons, which meant more competition for the men already paying. Risk number two was that the man behind the bar usually did not own the building he was standing in. Most respectable Western saloons operated under three separate layers of ownership. There was the person who owned the land, there was the person who owned the building sitting on that land, and there was the person who actually ran the saloon business inside it. Those layers were not an accident. They were a liability shield. The men who owned the ground under the saloons in a town like Fort Worth or Tombstone were frequently among the most respectable citizens in the community. State representatives, church elders, men who sat on civic boards. When the reform movements swept through and moral campaigns started demanding that the saloons be driven out of town, those landowners had perfectly clean hands. They had simply collected rent. The landlords stayed carefully above whatever happened behind the swinging doors. They took their money monthly and looked in the other direction. So the saloon keeper carried every ounce of the risk. He carried the license fee, the liquor tax, the staff payroll, the fixtures, the inventory, the legal exposure, and the entire moral reputation of the operation. And he sent a portion of whatever he cleared upstairs to a man whose name never appeared in a newspaper. If a proprietor got into trouble in one town, the usual solution was to pull up stakes entirely and start over somewhere else, which is precisely what Luke Short did when he left Dodge City for Fort Worth in late 1883. Risk number three was fire, and fire is the risk that made every other calculation on this list irrelevant. Consider what a frontier saloon physically was. A wood frame building, often shoulder to shoulder with other wood frame buildings, on a narrow main street, lit by open flame gas and oil lamps, filled with high-proof alcohol, sawdust on the floor, and men smoking cigars. In June of 1881, Tombstone had its first serious fire. It started a few doors east of the Oriental Saloon. The Oriental's adobe walls held against the flames, but the ornate interior that Milt Joyce had spent a fortune building went up fast. Joyce had cash stashed in a safe inside the building, and the fire moved so quickly he could not save any of it. He sold his interest in the Oriental to Rickabaugh shortly afterward. The building owners rebuilt, and the saloon reopened. Then, in May of 1882, Tombstone burned again. That time the fire crews made a stand at the Oriental and held it with a steady stream of water, and the damage stayed minor. That was luck and manpower, not planning. Deadwood, South Dakota tells the same story. The original Saloon Number 10, the establishment where Wild Bill Hickok was shot at a poker table in August of 1876, was destroyed when fire swept through the mining camp in 1879. There was no meaningful fire insurance market protecting a frontier saloon keeper. A single fire could erase every dollar a man had built over a decade in an afternoon. Along with the cash, he had been prudent enough to lock in a safe. Risk number 4 was violence, and violence was an operating expense rather than a plot point. Better saloons employed a special policeman, a man who functioned as the house bouncer, but who carried a genuine city or county commission and wore an actual badge. The critical detail is who signed his paycheck. The owner did. The saloon was privately funding public authority to protect its own floor. Owners also worked to attract real lawmen into their establishments, buying goodwill and drinks to keep a badge visibly present in the room. A saloon with a reputation for violence lost its best customers, and the men with the deepest pockets simply took their money to a competitor, and the violence often came from other saloons. In October of 1880, Doc Holliday got into an altercation inside the Oriental and was thrown out by Milt Joyce. Holliday came back with a pistol and opened fire from the doorway, wounding a bartender and winging Joyce himself. Joyce disarmed him and beat him with his own six-shooter until a Pima County deputy sheriff named Wyatt Earp arrived and arrested everyone involved. A year later, in October of 1881, Holliday clashed with a gambler named Johnny Tyler in the same building. Tyler had been hired by a rival gambling operation specifically to make trouble at the Oriental and disrupt its business. That is competitive sabotage as a business strategy, and Tombstone historians call the whole period the Gambler's War. The reputational math here is unforgiving. When the Earps left Tombstone after Morgan Earp's assassination in March of 1882, the Oriental slid back toward what contemporaries called a slaughterhouse reputation. Fights became routine, and the better class of gambler moved their business to the Crystal Palace and the Birdcage Theater. Milt Joyce, who had also owned a ranch outside town and served on the Cochise County Board of Supervisors, sold his interest in 1883 and left Tombstone in 1884. Risk number 5 is the one that separates frontier saloon economics from every modern comparison. Your entire customer base was a depleting resource. A saloon in a mining camp or a cattle town was not built on a stable local population. It was built on an extraction event. Abilene, Kansas was a stagecoach stop with a dozen families before the first Texas herd arrived in the summer of 1867. Then, it exploded, and its cattle boom lasted until roughly 1873, before the trade moved on to Wichita and then to Dodge City, where the cattle era itself wound down around 1885 and 1886. 6 years. That was the window in Abilene. Build a saloon, staff it, license it, furnish it, and the town that justified it is gone before the fixtures are paid off. The silver and gold camps ran on the same clock. Leadville, Colorado, boomed into a city of saloons, dance halls, and faro dens along Harrison Avenue and Chestnut Street in the late 1870s. Tombstone's silver flooded the mines, and the town emptied. Deadwood's placer gold ran thin. A saloon keeper was, in effect, making a leveraged bet on the geology under a town he did not survey, or on cattle trail routing decisions made by railroad executives 1,000 miles away. When the ore ran out or the railhead moved, his real estate, his fixtures, his liquor inventory, and his customers all became worthless at the same moment. And risk number 6 was the one that finally killed the industry outright. The moral clock was always running, and it only moved in one direction. As frontier towns matured, the respectable population that arrived after the saloons demanded an end to wide-open vice, and the reformers were strategic about it. The first blow was Sunday closing laws and ordinances restricting daily hours of operation, which directly cut the number of hours a saloon could sell anything. The second blow was aimed at gambling, and it was fatal because the reformers correctly identified the actual profit engine. Gambling was pushed behind closed doors and then driven underground entirely. That gutted revenue on both sides of the building because men stayed longer and drank far more when there were tables to play. Kansas voted in Prohibition around 1880, though enforcement there was famously casual for years. The third blow was regulatory surgery. Ordinances forced restaurant operations and saloon operations to separate, so the food side could escape the rules stacked against the drink side, which dismantled the free lunch model. And the fourth blow was aimed straight at those quiet men on the top layer of the ownership structure. Reformers put a public spotlight on the landowners and building owners, and shame accomplished what regulation could not. Many of them divested their saloon properties, rather than see their names in the newspaper. Federal prohibition arrived in 1920 and finished the classic Western saloon for good. For 13 years, speakeasies and rural roadhouses carried on a thin imitation of the tradition, and when Prohibition ended in 1933, the word saloon itself carried so much accumulated stigma that it never came back commercially. The businesses that replaced them called themselves bars and nightclubs instead. So let's close the ledger. Look at who actually made money off the Wild West saloon, and it is almost never the man you picture behind the bar. The landowner made money, collecting rent with clean hands and a respectable name. The brewery made money, eventually moving toward owning saloons outright to lock in demand. The professional gamblers made money, leasing the one room in the building where the margins were real and walking away to the next boomtown when the tables cooled. The town treasury made money on licenses, which is why it kept issuing more of them. The saloon keeper carried the tax, the license, the payroll, the fire risk, the violence, the moral exposure, and the geological bet. And this is where the popular image gets it exactly backward. The Wild West Saloon was not a destination. For an enormous number of the men who ran one, it was a way station, a solid interim line of work when other paths hit a dead end, a place to stand for a few years and save enough to buy land or win an election and get out. The ones who understood that were the ones who survived. They treated the saloon as a bridge, the ones who mistook it for a fortune, who poured everything into marble bars and crystal glassware in a town built on a vein of silver that nobody had measured, mostly lost it. The tent with 2 barrels and a plank was never really the bargain it looked like. It was the cheapest possible ticket into the hardest possible business. So now, you know what the drinks actually cost, where the real profit lived, and the 6 ways a frontier saloon could take a man's entire savings with it.